We dined on these occasions in the kitchen and adjourned for the nuts and oranges and apples to the parlour, which was a change very like Joe's change from his working clothes to his Sunday dress. My sister was uncommonly lively on the present occasion, and indeed was generally more gracious in the society of Mrs. Hubble than in any other company. I remember Mrs. Hubble as a little curly, sharp-edged person in sky blue, who held a conventionally juvenile position because she had married Mr. Hubble. I don't know at what remote period, when she was much younger than he. I remember Mr. Hubble as a tough, high-shouldered, stooping old man, of a dusty fragrance, with his legs extraordinarily wide apart, so that in my short days I always saw some miles of open country between them when I met him coming up the lane. Among this good company, I should have felt myself, even if I hadn't robbed the pantry, in a false position. Not because I was squeezed in at an acute angle of the tablecloth, with the table in my chest, and the Pumblechuckian elbow in my eye, nor because I was not allowed to speak, I didn't want to speak, nor because I was regaled with the scaly tips of the drumsticks of the fowls, and with those obscure corners of pork of which the pig, when living, had had the least reason to be vain. No, I should not have minded that if they would only have left me alone. But they wouldn't leave me alone. They seemed to think the opportunity lost if they failed to point the conversation at me every now and then and stick the point into me. I might have been an unfortunate little bull in a Spanish arena. I got so smartingly touched up by these moral goads. It began the moment we sat down to dinner. Mr. Wopsle said grace with theatrical declamation, as it now appears to me something like a religious cross of the Ghost in Hamlet with Richard III, and ended up with the very proper aspiration that we might be truly grateful. Upon which my sister fixed me with her eye and said, in a low, reproachful voice, "Do you hear that? Be grateful." "Especially," said Mr. Pumblechook, "be grateful, boy, to them which brought you up by hand." Mrs. Hubble shook her head, and contemplating me with a mournful presentiment that I should come to no good, asked, "Why is it that the young are never grateful?" This moral mystery seemed too much for the company, until Mr. Hubble tersely solved it by saying, "Naturally vicious." Everybody then murmured, "True," and looked at me in a particularly unpleasant and personal manner. Joe's station and influence were something feebler, if possible, when there was company than when there was none, but he always aided and comforted me when he could, in some way of his own. And he always did so at dinner time by giving me gravy, if there were any. There being plenty of gravy today, Joe spooned into my plate, at this point, about half a pint. A little later on in the dinner, Mr. Wopsle reviewed the sermon with some severity and intimated, in the usual hypothetical case of the church being thrown open, what kind of a sermon he would have given them. After favouring them with some heads of that discourse, he remarked that he considered the subject of the day's homily ill-chosen, which was the less excusable, he added, when there were so many subjects going about. "True again," said Uncle Pumblechook. "You've hit it, sir. Plenty of subjects going about for them that know how to put salt upon their tails. That's what's wanted. A man needn't go far to find a subject if he's ready with a salt box." Mr. Pumblechook added, after a short interval of reflection, "Look at pork alone. There's a subject. If you want a subject, look at pork." "True, sir. Many a moral for the young," returned Mr. Wopsle, and I knew he was going to lug me in. Before he said it, might be deduced from that text. "You listen to this," said my sister to me in a severe parenthesis. Joe gave me some more gravy. "Swine," pursued Mr. Wopsle in his deepest voice and pointing his fork at my blushes as if he were mentioning my Christian name. "Swine were the companions of the prodigal. The gluttony of swine is put before us as an example to the young." I thought this pretty well in him, who had been praising up the pork for being so plump and juicy. What is detestable in a pig is more detestable in a boy. Or girl, suggested Mr. Hubble. Of course, or girl, Mr. Hubble, assented Mr. Wopsle, rather irritably, but there is no girl present. "Besides," said Mr. Pumblechook, turning sharp on me, "think what you've got to be grateful for. If you've been born a squeaker—" "He was, if ever a child was," said my sister most empathetically. Joe gave me some more gravy. "Well, but I mean a four-footed squeaker," said Mr. Pumblechook. "If you had been born such, would you have been here now? Not you." "Unless in that form," said Mr. Wopsle, nodding towards the dish. But I don't mean in that form, sir, returned Mr. Pumblechook, with an objection to being interrupted. I mean enjoying himself with his elders and betters, and improving himself with their conversation, and rolling in the lap of luxury. Would he have been doing that? No, he wouldn't. And what would have been your destination? Turning on me again. You would have been disposed of for so many shillings according to the market price of the article, and Dunstable the butcher would have come up to you as you lay in your straw, and he would have whipped you under his left arm, and with his right he would have tucked up his frock to get a penknife from out of his waistcoat pocket, and he would have shed your blood and had your knife. No bringing up by hand then, not a bit of it. Joe offered me more gravy, which I was afraid to take. He was a world of trouble to you, man, said Mrs. Hubble, commiserating my sister. Trouble, echoed my sister, trouble, and then entered on a fearful catalogue of all the illnesses I had been guilty of, and all the acts of sleeplessness I had committed, and all the high places I had tumbled from, and all the low places I had tumbled into, and all the injuries I had done myself, and all the times she had wished me in my grave, and I had contumaciously refused to go there. I think the Romans must have aggravated one another very much with their noses. Perhaps they became the restless people they were in consequence. Anyhow, Mr. Wopsle's Roman's nose so aggravated me during the recital of my misdemeanours that I should have liked to pull it until he howled. But all I had endured up to this time was nothing in comparison with the awful feelings that took possession of me when the pause was broken, which ensued upon my sister's recital, and in which pause everybody had looked at me, as I felt painfully conscious, with indignation and abhorrence. Yet, said Mr. Pumblechook, leading the company gently back to the theme from which they had strayed, pork, regarded as biled, is rich too, ain't it? Have a little brandy, my uncle, said my sister. Oh heavens, it had come at last. He would find it was weak. He would say it was weak, and I was lost. I held tight to the leg of the table under the cloth with both hands and awaited my fate. My sister went for the stone bottle, came back with the stone bottle, and poured his brandy out, no one else taking any. The wretched man trifled with his glass, took it up, looked at it through the light, put it down, prolonged my misery. All this time Mrs. Joe and Joe were briskly clearing the table for the pie and pudding. I couldn't keep my eyes off him, always holding tight by the leg of the table with my hands and feet. I saw the miserable creature finger his glass playfully, take it up, smile, throw his head back, and drink the brandy off. Instantly afterwards the company were seized with unspeakable consternation, owing to his springing to his feet, turning round several times in an appalling spasmodic whooping cough dance, and rushing out at the door. He then became visible through the window, violently plunging and expectorating, making the most hideous faces, and apparently out of his mind. I held on tight while Mrs. Joe and Joe ran to him. I didn't know how I had done it, but I had no doubt I had murdered him somehow. In my dreadful situation, it was a relief when he was brought back, and surveying the company around us as if they had disagreed with him, sank down in his chair with the one significant gasp. Tar! I had filled up the bottle from the tar water jug. I knew he would be worse by and by. I moved the table like a medium of the present day by the vigour of my unseen hold upon it. Tar! Cried my sister in amazement. Why, however, could tar come there? But Uncle Pumblechook, who was omnipotent in that kitchen, wouldn't hear the word, wouldn't hear of the subject, imperiously waved it all away with his hand and asked for hot gin and water. My sister, who had begun to be alarmingly meditative, had to employ herself actively in getting the gin, the hot water, the sugar and the lemon peel, and mixing them. For the time at least I was saved. I still held on to the leg of the table, but clutched it now with the fervour of gratitude. By degrees I became calm enough to release my grasp and partake of pudding. Mr. Pumblechook partook of pudding. All partook of pudding. The course terminated, and Mr. Pumblechook had begun to beam under the genial influence of gin and water. I began to think I should get over the day when my sister said to Joe, "Clean plates, cold." I clutched the leg of the table immediately and pressed it to my bosom as if it had been the companion of my youth and friend of my soul. I foresaw what was coming, and I felt that this time I really was gone. "You must taste," said my sister, addressing the guest with her best grace. "You must taste to finish with such a delightful and delicious present of Uncle Pumblechook's." "Must they? Let them not hope to taste it." "You must know," said my sister, rising. "It's a pie, a savoury pork pie." The company murmured their compliments. Uncle Pumblechook, sensible of having deserved well of his fellow creature, said, quite vivaciously, all things considered, "Well, Mrs. Joe, we'll do our best endeavours. Let us have a cut at the same pie." My sister went out to get it. I heard her steps proceed to the pantry. I saw Mr. Pumblechook balance his knife. I saw reawakening appetite in the Roman nostrils of Mr. Wopsaw. I heard Mr. Hubble remark that a bit of savoury pork pie would lay atop of anything you could mention and do no harm. And I heard Joe say, "You shall have some, Pip." I've never been absolutely certain whether I uttered a shrill yell of terror, merely in spirit or in the bodily hearing of the company. I felt that I could bear no more and that I must run away. I released the leg of the table and ran for my life. But I ran no further than the house door, for there I ran head foremost into a party of soldiers with their muskets, one of whom held out a pair of handcuffs to me, saying, "Here you are, look sharp, come on."